Between 1950 and 1985, church ladies across America perfected 30 desserts that cost under $1, yet fed entire congregations at social gatherings. These weren't fancy bakery creations requiring expensive ingredients. They were dump cakes, Jell-O salads, and sheet pan, canned fruit, and Cool Whip that anyone could afford. Women earned reputations as legendary bakers when their contributions disappeared first from dessert tables. Then convenience culture arrived. Grocery store bakeries took over, and homemade church desserts vanished completely. Tonight, we're remembering all 30 forgotten dollar desserts from church social history. Texas sheet cake became known as funeral cake across the South during the 1950s because church ladies baked it for every funeral dinner served in church basements. The massive sheet cake fed 50 people from one pan and cost only 92 cents to make, using flour, sugar, cocoa powder, butter, buttermilk, and eggs. Grandmas mixed the batter directly in the pan to save dishes and poured hot chocolate frosting over the cake while it was still warm, so the icing soaked into every pore. The cake stayed incredibly moist for days without refrigeration, which made it perfect for potlucks where desserts sat out for hours. Church ladies competed to see whose Texas sheet cake disappeared first from the dessert table. The cake sliced into perfect squares that served easily on paper plates. Funeral directors in small southern towns knew which church ladies made the best Texas sheet cake and requested them specifically for bereaved families. The tradition continued through the 1980s until catered funeral meals replaced homemade church dinners. Have you ever eaten cake at a church basement funeral dinner? Wacky cake earned its crazy name during the Great Depression when housewives discovered they could make chocolate cake without eggs, milk, or butter. The recipe cost only 68 cents and used vinegar and baking soda to create the chemical reaction that made the cake rise instead of relying on eggs. Grandmas mixed the entire cake directly in the baking pan without dirtying a single bowl or measuring cup. 3 wells poked into the dry ingredients held vanilla extract, white vinegar, and melted shortening. Water poured over everything mixed it together with a fork. The cake baked into a tender, moist dessert that nobody could identify as egg-free or dairy-free until grandmas revealed the secret. Church ladies made wacky cake throughout the 1950s and 1960s when ingredients were expensive and budgets were tight. The simplicity meant even children could make it successfully without adult supervision. Schools taught wacky cake in home economics classes as an example of Depression-era resourcefulness. Have you ever made cake without breaking a single egg? Jell-O poke cake became the signature dessert of 1970s church potlucks when Jell-O Company printed the recipe on gelatin boxes and started a national craze. The revolutionary technique required baking a white cake, poking holes all over it with wooden spoon handles, and pouring liquid Jell-O over the hot cake so the gelatin soaked into every hole. The cake cooled in refrigerators overnight, while the Jell-O set into colorful stripes throughout each slice. Cool Whip spread over the top created a white frosting that contrasted beautifully with the bright red, blue, or green Jell-O colors. Church ladies made patriotic poke cakes with red and blue Jell-O for 4th of July potlucks. Christmas versions used red and green Jell-O in alternating rows. Each slice showed stunning striped patterns that looked far more complicated than the simple recipe actually was. The cake cost only 84 cents to make and fed 20 people easily. Kids loved the bright colors and sweet Jell-O flavor. Have you ever poked holes in cake on purpose? Dirt cake became the most popular children's Sunday school dessert in the 1980s when creative church ladies discovered they could crush Oreo cookies, mix them with chocolate pudding, and serve the combination in new plastic flower pots with gummy worms on top. The dessert looked exactly like potting soil, complete with realistic worms, which delighted children and disgusted adults in equal measure. Making dirt cake cost only 76 cents and required no baking or cooking whatsoever. Church ladies assembled dirt cake in clear glass bowls so everyone could see the layers of crushed Oreos and chocolate pudding. Some versions added cream cheese to make the pudding layer richer and more stable. Artificial flowers stuck into the dirt completed the garden theme and made the dessert look like actual flower pots. Children's birthday parties, vacation Bible school celebrations, and Easter Sunday school parties featured dirt cake throughout the 1980s and early 1990s. The dessert disappeared when parents became concerned about food safety and hygiene. Have you ever eaten dessert from a flower pot? Watergate salad earned its scandalous name in 1975 during the Watergate political scandal and became an instant church potluck sensation, despite nobody knowing why it was called Watergate. The bright green dessert combined pistachio pudding mix, crushed pineapple, mini marshmallows, chopped pecans, and Cool Whip into a fluffy salad that cost only 88 cents to make. Grandmas never cooked the pudding, they just stirred the dry powder directly into the other ingredients and let it set up in refrigerators overnight. The neon green color made Watergate salad instantly recognizable on crowded potluck tables. Some church ladies called it pistachio delight or green fluff to avoid the political reference. The salad appeared at every church dinner, wedding reception, and holiday gathering throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s. Children loved the sweet marshmallows and bright color. The dessert required no cooking skills whatsoever, which made it accessible to even the most inexperienced cooks. Have you ever eaten bright green salad that was actually dessert? 5 church social desserts down, and every single one cost less than $1 to feed entire congregations. From funeral cakes to political scandal salads, these recipes defined church basement potlucks for decades. Nobody passes them down anymore. But the next 5 desserts are even more forgotten. Scripture cake became the ultimate Sunday school teaching tool in the 1950s, when church ladies wrote recipes entirely in Bible verses that required looking up each ingredient in the Bible. Judges 5:25 meant butter, Jeremiah 6:20 meant sugar, and 1 Samuel 14:25 meant honey. Children learned Bible verses while helping grandmas decode the mysterious recipe that cost only 94 cents to make. The finished cake was a dense, spiced fruit cake loaded with raisins, figs, almonds, and warm spices. Scripture cake appeared in nearly every church cookbook published between 1920 and 1970, with slight variations in which Bible verses represented which ingredients. Making the cake became a family activity where everyone gathered around the kitchen table with Bibles open, searching for the correct passages. The cake baked for over an hour and filled the house with cinnamon and clove aromas. Modern families stopped making scripture cake when biblical literacy declined and nobody wanted to spend time looking up verses. Have you ever decoded a recipe written entirely in Bible verses? 7-Up cake revolutionized church potluck baking in the 1960s when the 7-Up company printed this recipe in magazine advertisements and convinced housewives that lemon-lime soda made cakes moister and fluffier than any other liquid. The cake combined butter, sugar, eggs, flour, and 1 full cup of 7-Up into a dense pound cake that cost only 78 cents to make. The carbonation in the soda created tiny air bubbles throughout the batter that made the cake incredibly tender. Church ladies argued whether Sprite worked as well as 7-Up or if the recipe required authentic 7-Up specifically. The cake baked in bundt pans and turned out glazed with lemon frosting, made from more 7-Up mixed with powdered sugar. The subtle lemon-lime flavor was sophisticated and unusual compared to chocolate or vanilla cakes that dominated church dessert tables. The cake stayed fresh for over a week when wrapped tightly. Have you ever baked a cake with soda instead of milk? Sock-It-To-Me cake earned its hilarious name from the popular 1960s TV show Laugh-In, where comedians yelled, "Sock it to me," as a catchphrase that swept the nation. Duncan Hines created this cake mix specifically to capitalize on the trend and printed the name in huge letters on the box. The cake featured a ribbon of brown sugar, cinnamon, and pecans swirled through the middle and cost only 82 cents to make when using the boxed mix. Church ladies made Sock-It-To-Me cake for every potluck throughout the late 1960s and 1970s because the name was funny and the cake was foolproof. The cinnamon swirl stayed perfectly centered when the cake was sliced, creating beautiful presentation. Some grandmas made the cake from scratch without using Duncan Hines mix by making their own yellow cake batter and adding the cinnamon ribbon. The cake eventually disappeared when the TV show ended and the catchphrase stopped being funny. Have you ever eaten cake named after a TV show catchphrase? Lazy Daisy cake became the essential church ladies' coffee cake in the 1950s when Woman's Day magazine published this simple recipe featuring a hot-broiled coconut topping that caramelized into candy-like frosting. The cake itself cost only 64 cents to make, using basic ingredients like flour, sugar, eggs, milk, butter, and vanilla. Grandmas mixed the simple batter and baked it in square pans for 25 minutes. While the cake was still hot from the oven, they spread a mixture of brown sugar, butter, coconut, and cream over the top and put the entire pan under the broiler for 3 minutes. The broiler caramelized the coconut topping into a golden, crunchy layer that cracked when you pressed a fork against it. The cake underneath stayed tender and moist. Church ladies served Lazy Daisy cake at morning fellowship hours and afternoon ladies' circle meetings throughout the 1950s and 1960s. The name came from how easy it was to make, so easy a Lazy Daisy could do it. Have you ever put cake under the broiler to make frosting? Tomato soup cake shocked church potluck guests in the 1950s when they discovered the secret ingredient was an entire can of Campbell's condensed tomato soup mixed directly into spice cake batter. The bizarre recipe cost only 72 cents and created incredibly moist cake that nobody could identify as containing soup until grandmas revealed the surprise. The tomato soup replaced eggs and oil in traditional cake recipes and added moisture that kept the cake fresh for over a week without refrigeration. Campbell's Soup Company printed the recipe on tomato soup can labels starting in 1948 and promoted it heavily in women's magazines. The cake tasted like spice cake with cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and raisins throughout. Cream cheese frosting covered the top and balanced the subtle tomato flavor that lurked in the background. Church ladies made tomato soup cake throughout the 1950s and 1960s as conversation starter desserts that always generated recipe requests. The tradition died when Campbell's stopped printing the recipe on soup cans. Have you ever baked a cake with canned soup? Cherry dump cake became the laziest dessert in church potluck history when housewives discovered they could dump canned cherry pie filling into pans, sprinkle dry cake mix over the top, pour melted butter over everything, and bake it without mixing anything together. The revolutionary dump and bake method cost only 86 cents and required zero skill, zero measuring cups, and zero mixing bowls. Grandmas literally dumped ingredients into greased 9x13 pans in layers and walked away until the timer dinged 45 minutes later. The cake baked into a cobbler-like dessert with sweet cherry filling on the bottom and crispy buttery cake topping that resembled streusel. The edges turned golden brown and crunchy, while the center stayed soft and gooey. Church ladies made cherry dump cake for every potluck, funeral dinner, and church bazaar throughout the 1970s and 1980s because it was foolproof and transported beautifully without falling apart. The recipe appeared in church cookbooks across America with identical instructions: 1 can cherry pie filling, 1 box yellow cake mix, 1 stick melted butter. Some variations added chopped pecans or coconut sprinkled between the layers. The cake served warm, with vanilla ice cream melting into the cherry filling, created the perfect church basement dessert experience. Cherry dump cake represented the ultimate convenience cooking that defined 1970s church lady culture. The dessert required no cooking knowledge whatsoever, which meant even the worst bakers could bring something impressive to potlucks. Pineapple dump cake followed the same miraculous dump and bake method as cherry dump cake, but used crushed pineapple instead of cherry pie filling to create a tropical dessert that cost only 74 cents. Grandmas dumped crushed pineapple with its juice into greased pans, sprinkled dry yellow cake mix over the fruit, scattered pieces of butter across the top, and baked everything without stirring. The pineapple juice soaked up into the dry cake mix during baking and created moist cake with crispy, buttery edges. The finished dessert tasted like pineapple upside-down cake, but required 1/10 of the effort and none of the skill that traditional upside-down cakes demanded. Church ladies made pineapple dump cake for summer potlucks and outdoor church picnics because the tropical flavor seemed appropriate for warm weather gatherings. The cake transported easily in the same pan it baked in, which eliminated the need for fancy serving platters or cake stands. Some grandmas added coconut or chopped maraschino cherries to make the pineapple dump cake more festive and colorful. Others mixed the pineapple with mandarin oranges for extra citrus flavor. The variations were endless, but the basic dump and bake method stayed the same: no mixing, no bowls, no measuring beyond opening cans and boxes. Pineapple dump cake dominated church basement dessert tables throughout the 1970s, alongside its cherry cousin. Banana pudding became the most contested church social dessert in Southern history because every church lady claimed her version was authentic and everyone else's was wrong. The traditional recipe cost only 98 cents and layered vanilla wafers, sliced bananas, and vanilla pudding in glass bowls or aluminum pans. The controversy centered on whether real pudding should be cooked from scratch on the stove or whether instant pudding was acceptable for church potlucks. Old-school grandmas insisted on cooked pudding made with eggs, milk, sugar, and cornstarch, stirred constantly over low heat until thick enough to coat spoons. Modern church ladies defended instant pudding as equally delicious and far more practical for busy women who worked outside the home. The debate raged through church basements across the South for decades without resolution. Both camps agreed that meringue topping was mandatory and that Cool Whip was an abomination that disqualified any banana pudding from being considered authentic. The meringue required separating eggs, beating egg whites to stiff peaks with cream of tartar and sugar, spreading the fluffy white clouds over the pudding layers, and baking the entire dish until the meringue turned golden brown with toasted peaks. Properly made meringue stayed fluffy for hours, without weeping or deflating. Church ladies who brought banana pudding with deflated, watery meringue faced judgment and whispered criticism from other women in the church kitchen. Banana pudding appeared at every church dinner, funeral meal, and potluck throughout the South, from the 1950s through the 1990s. The dessert was so ubiquitous that some churches had 3 or 4 identical banana puddings on the dessert table at single events. By 2000, the tradition had declined as younger generations rejected the labor-intensive meringue topping and made banana pudding with Cool Whip instead, which horrified traditional Southern grandmas. Have you ever caused a church controversy over pudding? Strawberry pretzel salad confused church potluck guests throughout the 1970s and 1980s because it was called salad but tasted like dessert, and nobody understood which category it belonged in on the buffet table. The three-layer creation cost 92 cents and started with a crust made from crushed pretzels, butter, and sugar baked until crispy. The salty sweet pretzel crust cooled completely before grandmas spread a cream cheese layer mixed with sugar and Cool Whip over the top. The final layer featured strawberry jello, with frozen strawberries suspended throughout that set firm in refrigerators. The pretzel crust stayed crunchy for the first few hours, but eventually got soggy from the cream cheese and jello layers above it, which created ongoing debates about whether to assemble the salad the night before or the morning of the potluck. Strawberry pretzel salad appeared at every church potluck, wedding reception, and holiday dinner throughout the 1980s and early 1990s. The recipe spread through church cookbooks so rapidly that multiple women brought identical versions to the same events. By 2000, the trend had faded as new dessert fashions replaced the pretzel salad. Today, it exists only in Midwest church communities where traditions die slowly. Have you ever eaten salty pretzels in dessert? Mandarin orange cake became the easiest cake in church potluck history when grandmas discovered they could dump a can of mandarin oranges with the juice directly into yellow cake mix, add eggs, stir everything together, and bake it into incredibly moist cake that cost only 84 cents. The mandarin oranges replaced the oil and water that cake mixes normally required and added subtle citrus flavor throughout every bite. The oranges broke down during mixing and created bright orange specks throughout the yellow cake. The frosting was equally revolutionary. Crushed pineapple mixed with instant vanilla pudding and Cool Whip created a fluffy, cloud-like topping that required no cooking and set up in refrigerators within hours. The pineapple pudding frosting became so popular that church ladies started using it on other cakes and calling it church frosting, because it appeared at every church event. Mandarin orange cake dominated church dessert tables throughout the 1970s and 1980s because it was foolproof, cheap, and unusual enough to seem special without being intimidating. The bright orange color made it visually distinctive among chocolate and white cakes. The cake stayed incredibly moist for days without drying out, which made it perfect for potlucks, where desserts sat out at room temperature for hours. Some church ladies added coconut to the batter for extra tropical flavor. Others mixed the mandarin oranges with crushed pineapple for double fruit impact. The variations were endless, but the basic dump and stir method stayed the same. By 1995, mandarin orange cake had saturated church potluck culture so completely that it became cliché and boring. The younger generation stopped making it because it seemed too associated with their mothers' and grandmothers' generations. Have you ever put canned fruit in cake batter? Earthquake cake earned its dramatic name from the cracked, destroyed appearance that resulted when cream cheese and coconut erupted through German chocolate cake during baking and created a landscape that looked like earthquake damage. The chaotic dump cake cost 96 cents and required dumping coconut and pecans into greased pans, dropping spoonfuls of cream cheese and butter over the nuts, sprinkling German chocolate cake mix over everything, pouring water over the dry mix, and baking without stirring. During baking, the cream cheese sank to the bottom while the coconut rose to the top, and the cake cracked and fissured dramatically. The finished cake looked absolutely terrible, lumpy, cracked, uneven, and messy, but tasted incredible with pockets of cream cheese, coconut, pecans, and chocolate throughout every slice. Church ladies who brought earthquake cake always warned first-time tasters not to judge it by appearance. The ugly cake became a church potluck favorite throughout the 1980s, because it was conversation starting, and delicious, despite looking like a baking disaster. Some church cookbooks called it dump cake, crazy cake, or mixed-up cake, but earthquake cake was the most popular name because it accurately described the destroyed appearance. The cake required absolutely zero skill and actually tasted better when it looked worse. Trying to make earthquake cake look pretty defeated the entire purpose and reduced the dramatic visual impact. Earthquake cake represented the ultimate acceptance of imperfection in church potluck culture, where homemade effort mattered more than professional appearance. The dessert celebrated chaos and mess as virtues rather than flaws. By 1995, earthquake cake had disappeared from church tables as food photography culture made ugly desserts unacceptable. Today, almost nobody makes intentionally ugly cakes anymore. Have you ever made a cake that looked like a natural disaster? Pudding poke cake followed the same poke and pour technique as Jell-O poke cake, but used instant pudding instead of gelatin to create a creamier, richer dessert that cost 88 cents. Grandmas baked white or yellow cake in sheet pans, poked holes all over the hot cake with wooden spoon handles, and poured liquid pudding made with only half the normal milk amount over the surface. The thick pudding soaked down into the holes and created creamy pockets throughout the cake. The cake cooled in refrigerators for at least 4 hours, while the pudding set firm inside all the holes. Cool Whip spread over the top created white frosting that contrasted with chocolate or butterscotch pudding colors showing through. Some church ladies made pudding poke cake with white pudding so the cake looked plain and boring until someone cut into it and discovered the hidden creamy filling. Pudding poke cake appeared at church potlucks throughout the 1970s and 1980s alongside Jell-O poke cake. The two poke cakes often appeared at the same events, which created confusion about which was which until people tasted them. Pudding poke cake had richer, creamier flavor, while Jell-O poke cake was lighter and fruitier. Church ladies developed strong preferences for pudding versus Jell-O versions and defended their chosen method passionately. Coca-Cola cake became the signature dessert of Southern church potlucks in the 1960s, when the Coca-Cola Company promoted this recipe heavily in regional magazines and convinced housewives that Coke made chocolate cake moister than any other liquid. The cake cost only 76 cents and used 1 full cup of Coca-Cola in the batter, plus another half cup in the hot fudge frosting poured over the cake while still warm. The carbonation in the Coke created tiny bubbles throughout the batter that made the cake incredibly light and tender. Church ladies argued whether Pepsi worked as well as Coke, or if the recipe specifically required Coca-Cola for authentic results. Most grandmas insisted that only real Coke produced the proper flavor and texture, though blind taste tests rarely revealed any difference. The cake baked in sheet pans and required making hot fudge frosting on the stove by boiling butter, Coca-Cola, and cocoa powder together before pouring it over the hot cake straight from the oven. The hot frosting soaked into the warm cake and created a fudgy, brownie-like texture that was denser and richer than regular chocolate cake. Chopped pecans scattered over the wet frosting stuck to the surface as it cooled. The finished cake was intensely chocolate and incredibly moist, with subtle Coca-Cola flavor in the background that most people couldn't identify. Coca-Cola cake dominated church dessert tables across the South throughout the 1960s and 1970s. The recipe appeared in virtually every community church cookbook published during those decades. By 1985, the trend had faded as new cake fashions replaced the Coke cake. Today, younger generations have never heard of putting soda in chocolate cake. Have you ever tasted Coca-Cola in cake? Scotcheroos became the essential church bake sale treat in the 1960s when Kellogg's printed this recipe on Rice Krispies cereal boxes and created a sensation that swept through church communities nationwide. The no-bake bars cost only 68 cents and required cooking corn syrup and sugar together until bubbling, stirring in peanut butter until melted, mixing in Rice Krispies cereal, pressing the mixture into greased pans, and topping everything with melted chocolate and butterscotch chips. The bars set firm at room temperature within 2 hours and sliced into perfect squares. Church ladies made dozens of pans of scotcheroos for bake sales, funeral dinners, and potluck desserts throughout the 1960s and 1970s. The combination of peanut butter, chocolate, and butterscotch was incredibly popular with children who begged their mothers to make scotcheroos at home. The bars were less messy than Rice Krispies treats and more sophisticated with the chocolate butterscotch topping. Some regions called them Special K bars when made with Special K cereal instead of Rice Krispies. Other variations used Cheerios or Corn Flakes. The basic recipe stayed the same regardless of which cereal was used. Gooey butter cake became St. Louis's contribution to church potluck culture in the 1950s, when a local baker accidentally reversed the proportions of butter and flour in coffee cake and created a dessert with a cake-like bottom layer and a gooey, custard-like top that became a regional obsession. The mistake cake cost 94 cents to replicate and required pressing yellow cake mix mixed with butter and 1 egg into the bottom of greased pans to create the base layer. The topping combined cream cheese, remaining eggs, powdered sugar, and vanilla into a sweet, gooey mixture poured over the cake layer. During baking, the cream cheese topping stayed gooey and custard-like, while the cake bottom layer set firm. The finished dessert had a distinctive 2-layer texture that was unlike any other cake. The top remained so gooey that it jiggled when the pan was shaken. Powdered sugar dusted over the cooled cake created a white coating that looked elegant and hid the gooey mess underneath. Gooey butter cake spread from St. Louis church basements to surrounding states throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Church ladies outside Missouri had never seen anything like it and couldn't decide if it was cake, custard, or pie. The unusual texture was polarizing. People either loved the gooey top obsessively or found it undercooked and unpleasant. St. Louis church ladies brought gooey butter cake to every potluck and bake sale with regional pride. The dessert became so associated with St. Louis that bringing it to church events signaled St. Louis heritage. By 1985, commercial bakeries started mass-producing gooey butter cake, which reduced the homemade tradition. Have you ever made cake that stayed gooey on purpose? 20 church social desserts complete, and every single one defined decades of fellowship dinners, funeral meals, and potluck suppers. From earthquake cakes to gooey mistakes, these recipes fed congregations for under $1. Nobody teaches them anymore. But the final 10 are the strangest church desserts ever created. $1 Million cake earned its luxurious name not from expensive ingredients, but from the rich taste achieved with humble pantry staples that cost well under $1 in the 1960s. This pineapple-laden dessert became a church social legend across the South, particularly in Texas and Louisiana, where home bakers discovered that crushed pineapple, basic cake flour, eggs, sugar, and pecans could create something that tasted far more expensive than its actual cost. The cake required no frosting because the pineapple baked directly into the batter, creating a moist, self-glazing texture that stayed fresh for days, making it perfect for weekend church events, when desserts needed to survive from Saturday preparation through Sunday service. Church ladies appreciated that this cake actually improved overnight, as the pineapple juice soaked through every crumb, eliminating the last-minute baking panic that plagued other desserts. The pecans, often gathered free from backyard trees throughout the South, added the only expensive element, though most cooks used them sparingly or substituted cheaper walnuts without anyone noticing. The beauty of million-dollar cake lay in its impressive appearance. It looked like something from a fancy bakery, with its golden crust and jewel-like pineapple pieces visible through each slice, yet every ingredient came from the most basic grocery list. Women shared countless variations at church gatherings, some adding coconut, others incorporating buttermilk, but the core recipe remained remarkably consistent across congregations and denominations. Have you ever tasted a cake that earned its million-dollar name from flavor rather than cost? Friendship cake represented far more than dessert. It embodied an entire social system that connected church communities through shared starter culture, passed from neighbor to neighbor in never-ending chains of baking obligation and goodwill. The process began when someone gave you a sealed bag containing fermenting fruit starter, along with strict instructions to squeeze the bag daily, feed it sugar and fruit on specific days, then bake one cake for yourself while dividing the remaining starter into bags to give 3 friends, perpetuating the cycle indefinitely. This Amish tradition spread through Midwestern church communities in the 1970s and 1980s, creating networks of women bound together by 10-day baking schedules they couldn't abandon without breaking the chain and disappointing everyone who'd gifted them starter. The actual ingredients cost mere pennies. The starter contained sugar, canned fruit cocktail, and yeast, while the cake itself required basic flour, eggs, oil, and vanilla pudding mix, keeping the total expense well under $1, even when feeding a crowd. Churches loved friendship cake because it generated conversation, created accountability within congregations, and ensured that multiple families brought similar desserts to potlucks, creating beautiful uniformity across dessert tables without requiring coordination. The cakes tasted pleasantly sweet with chunks of fruit throughout, though the real appeal wasn't flavor, but rather participation in something larger than individual baking. You were part of an unbroken chain connecting dozens of church families across towns and sometimes states. Women displayed their starter bags on kitchen counters like badges of social connection, and feeding the starter became a daily ritual that structured their routines around church community even on days when they never left home. The fermentation process created slight alcohol content that some stricter denominations questioned, leading to theological debates about whether friendship cake violated principles of temperance, though most churches accepted it as harmless since the alcohol cooked off during baking. Have you ever been part of a baking chain that connected you to neighbors you'd never met? Prune cake occupied a peculiar position in church social hierarchy, scorned by children, beloved by elderly congregants, and tolerated by everyone else as the price of intergenerational fellowship at potluck dinners. This Depression-era survival cake originated when dried prunes represented one of the cheapest ways to add moisture, sweetness, and nutrients to baked goods, costing just pennies per pound and lasting indefinitely in pantries when fresh fruit remained a luxury. The basic recipe called for chopped prunes, simmered until soft, then mixed into simple cake batter with flour, sugar, eggs, buttermilk, and warm spices like cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg that masked the prune's distinctive flavor for skeptical eaters. Church ladies appreciated that prune cake stayed incredibly moist for days without refrigeration, making it ideal for weekend socials when desserts sat out for hours. And the prune's natural laxative properties were quietly valued by older church members who discussed such matters in hushed post-service conversations. The cake cost well under $1 to make even when prices rose in the 1970s, since prunes remained unfashionable enough that stores practically gave them away, and many rural families still had access to home-dried plums that cost nothing beyond labor. Women developed elaborate strategies to make prune cake more appealing to younger generations, covering it with thick caramel frosting, adding chopped pecans for crunch, or calling it spice cake on the potluck label without mentioning the prune content until after children had tasted it. Some congregations featured legendary bakers whose prune cakes converted skeptics, women who'd perfected the prune-to-batter ratio and knew exactly how long to simmer the fruit to achieve pudding-like moisture without creating soggy spots that indicated amateur technique. The cake carried strong generational associations. It reminded elderly members of Depression hardships when prunes appeared in everything from cakes to bread puddings, while younger people associated prunes exclusively with digestive remedies their grandparents consumed, killing any appetite for prune-based desserts. Applesauce cake emerged from Depression-era necessity, when home cooks discovered that applesauce could replace expensive butter and eggs while keeping cakes moist, cutting costs to just pennies per serving, and launching this humble dessert into permanent church social rotation. Rural families made their own applesauce from windfall apples that cost nothing, backyard fruit that would otherwise rot, or seconds purchased cheaply from orchards, then canned jars and jars each autumn to use throughout the year in baking that stretched tight budgets. The basic recipe combined applesauce, flour, sugar, baking soda, cinnamon, cloves, and raisins into a dense, fragrant cake that required no frosting because the applesauce created natural moisture that lasted for days, perfect for church events where desserts needed to survive from Saturday baking through Sunday serving without drying out. Church ladies loved applesauce cake because even families struggling financially could afford to contribute something to potlucks, and the cake's humble origins carried no shame, since everyone understood that stretching ingredients demonstrated thrift rather than poverty. The spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, allspice, filled church basements with warmth during cold weather socials, creating olfactory memories that people carried for decades, forever associating those scents with community and belonging. Women developed strong opinions about applesauce cake technique, debating whether chunky or smooth applesauce produced better texture, whether raisins should be chopped or left whole, and whether the batter should include nuts, despite the added expense. Some congregations featured competitive bakers who added their own signatures to applesauce cake, a cream cheese frosting, despite the original being unfrosted, a streusel topping that added crunch, or a caramel glaze that elevated this peasant cake to something special. The cake served double duty as breakfast and dessert, appearing at sunrise prayer breakfasts as often as evening potlucks, its lack of frosting and fruit-based moisture making it acceptable morning food in ways that chocolate cake could never achieve. Applesauce cake maintained popularity through the 1970s, but faded as homemade applesauce disappeared from most pantries, replaced by store-bought jars that cost more than butter, eliminating the economic advantage that had originally justified this substitution. Modern cooks also rejected the dense, heavy texture that Depression-era bakers prized. Contemporary tastes prefer light, fluffy cakes that applesauce's weight and moisture prevent, making this once-beloved recipe feel outdated and texturally wrong to palates raised on box mixes engineered for airiness. Have you ever tasted a cake that proved fruit could replace butter without anyone missing the difference? Glorified rice occupied the strange borderland between dessert and salad at church socials, a sweet concoction that combined cooked rice, crushed pineapple, miniature marshmallows, and whipped cream into something that defied category but appeared at every Midwestern Lutheran and Methodist potluck from the 1940s through the 1980s. This dish emerged from Depression thrift when leftover rice needed purpose, and basic ingredients like canned pineapple and marshmallows cost pennies, creating a filling dessert that stretched budgets while feeding crowds for well under $1 total. Church ladies appreciated that glorified rice required no baking, just cooking rice, draining canned pineapple, folding in marshmallows, and adding whipped cream or Cool Whip, making it perfect for summer socials when ovens would heat up church basements unbearably. The dish improved when refrigerated overnight as flavors melded and marshmallows partially dissolved into sweet pockets throughout, meaning it actually benefited from advanced preparation that reduced last-minute social stress. Scandinavian Lutheran congregations in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Dakotas claimed glorified rice as cultural heritage, though similar versions appeared in German Reformed and Methodist churches under different names like heavenly rice or ambrosia rice. The recipe varied wildly between families. Some added maraschino cherries for color, others included mandarin oranges or fruit cocktail, and debates raged about whether proper glorified rice required whipped cream or whether Cool Whip constituted acceptable substitution once it appeared in the 1960s. Children generally loved glorified rice because it tasted like dessert, but adults served it as salad, creating confusion that allowed second helpings without guilt about eating too many sweets. The dish carried strong generational and regional markers. If you grew up in the upper Midwest attending Lutheran potlucks, glorified rice formed essential childhood food memories. But people from other regions often encountered it with bewilderment, unable to understand why anyone would combine rice, fruit, and marshmallows, or why such combinations were called salad, despite being obviously sweet. We've explored church social staples from million-dollar cake to glorified rice, each costing under $1, yet feeding dozens. These recipes built community through shared baking and potluck traditions that younger generations never learned. Let's discover 5 more forgotten desserts that once filled church basements with sweetness and connection. Harvey Wallbanger cake brought cocktail culture to church socials in the most unexpected way, transforming a trendy 1970s vodka and Galliano drink into a bright orange bundt cake that contained no actual alcohol yet captured the era's fascination with sophisticated adult flavors. The cake emerged during the height of the Harvey Wallbanger cocktail's popularity, when creative home bakers began adding vodka and Galliano liqueur to cake batters, then discovered that orange juice and vanilla pudding mix could approximate the flavor profile without the alcohol, making it acceptable for church events where spirits remained forbidden. The recipe started with a basic orange cake mix, then added instant vanilla pudding, eggs, oil, orange juice, and just enough vodka and Galliano to flavor without intoxicating, though church versions often replaced the alcohol entirely with orange extract and vanilla, preserving the name while eliminating the controversy. Cost remained well under $1 since cake mix and pudding mix represented the cheapest possible baking foundations, and the orange juice came from frozen concentrate that most families already had in their freezers for breakfast. Church ladies loved Harvey Wallbanger cake because it sounded worldly and sophisticated, bringing a touch of glamour to potluck tables usually dominated by traditional recipes their mothers had made, allowing them to feel modern without actually serving alcohol or doing anything scandalous. The bright orange color, intensified by the orange juice and sometimes food coloring, made the cake visually striking on dessert tables, and the bundt pan shape suggested bakery quality even though the recipe required minimal skill. The glaze, made from powdered sugar, orange juice, and vanilla, soaked into the still warm cake, creating intense sweetness and moisture that lasted for days, perfect for leftovers sent home with elderly shut-ins after Sunday service. The name generated endless jokes and conversations, with younger church members who actually frequented bars explaining the cocktail to puzzled older ladies who'd made the cake without understanding its alcoholic origins. Harvey Wallbanger cake peaked in the late 1970s, then faded quickly as cocktail culture shifted. The Harvey Wallbanger drink itself became dated, and church socials moved away from recipes with alcohol-related names, even when no actual spirits appeared in the ingredients. Modern church gatherings never feature this cake, because no one under 50 has heard of Harvey Wallbanger cocktails. The name sounds vaguely inappropriate without context, and orange-flavored cakes seem outdated compared to chocolate lava cakes and red velvet trends that dominate contemporary dessert tables. Have you ever made a cake named after a cocktail you'd never tasted or even heard of before? Pink salad graced church social tables across America with its distinctively pastel appearance. A creamy blend of cottage cheese, strawberry jello, crushed pineapple, and Cool Whip that occupied the ambiguous territory between dessert and side dish that only church potlucks could navigate. This 1960s invention emerged when cottage cheese represented health food. Jello powder offered instant flavor. Cool Whip provided affordable creaminess, and the combination cost well under $1 while feeding dozens of people at gatherings where quantity mattered more than culinary sophistication. The recipe required no cooking, just mixing dry strawberry jello powder into cottage cheese until it turned pink, folding in drained crushed pineapple, then lightening the mixture with Cool Whip and refrigerating until firm enough to serve with a spoon. Church ladies appreciated the make-ahead convenience, since pink salad improved overnight as flavors melded, and the cottage cheese provided protein that justified serving this sweet dish alongside casseroles rather than restricting it to the dessert table. The pink color brought cheerfulness to potluck spreads, especially at baby showers, Easter brunches, and spring socials where pastel aesthetics matched seasonal decorating themes. Women developed fierce loyalties to their particular pink salad variations. Some added miniature marshmallows, others included mandarin oranges or maraschino cherries, and debates raged about whether small curd or large curd cottage cheese produced superior texture. The dish carried strong regional and denominational patterns, appearing most frequently at Methodist and Presbyterian gatherings in the Midwest and South, while rarely showing up at Catholic or Lutheran events where European culinary traditions resisted Jell-O-based innovations. Children's reactions to pink salad depended entirely on whether they encountered the cottage cheese curds as delightful texture or revolting lumps, creating lifelong love or hatred with no middle ground. The name itself generated confusion, since salad implied vegetables, but pink salad contained none, leading to philosophical discussions about whether sweetness, Jell-O content, or serving temperature determined category classification at church potlucks. Pink salad peaked in the 1970s and early 1980s when cottage cheese diet culture dominated women's magazines and Cool Whip represented modern convenience, but it disappeared rapidly as low-fat cottage cheese trends faded. People recognized that adding Jell-O and Cool Whip negated any health benefits, and younger generations rejected dishes where cottage cheese appeared in dessert contexts. Modern church socials rarely feature pink salad because cottage cheese has returned to savory applications. The pink color seems artificially dated, and contemporary food culture has largely abandoned the sweet salad category that once filled entire potluck table sections. Have you ever eaten something pink and sweet that somehow counted as salad instead of dessert? Ritz cracker pie stood as perhaps the most audacious deception in church social history, a dessert that convinced countless potluck attendees they were eating apple pie when no apples existed anywhere in the recipe, only crushed Ritz crackers, sugar, and lemon, creating an impossible flavor illusion. This Depression-era marvel emerged when apples were expensive or unavailable, and creative cooks discovered that Ritz crackers, soaked in lemon sugar syrup and baked in pie crust with cinnamon, produced texture and tartness remarkably similar to apple filling at a fraction of the cost. The recipe required only crackers, sugar, cream of tartar, lemon juice, butter, and cinnamon, ingredients that cost mere pennies and kept the entire pie well under $1, even when serving 8 people substantial slices. Church ladies loved Ritz cracker pie for its conversation-starting novelty, and women gained reputations as creative bakers when they revealed the secret ingredient to shocked guests who'd been completely fooled by the cracker transformation. The pie worked best when bakers followed the timing precisely. The crackers needed enough baking time to soften and absorb the syrup completely, but not so long that they turned mushy, a delicate balance that separated expert bakers from amateurs whose pies turned out obviously wrong-textured. Some congregations featured legendary bakers whose Ritz cracker pies were indistinguishable from real apple, women who'd perfected the cracker-to-syrup ratio and knew exactly how much lemon juice created authentic tartness without revealing the deception. The pie appeared most frequently during winter months, when fresh apples grew expensive and summer's canned apple supply had been depleted, filling the gap in church social dessert offerings until spring brought cheaper fruit. Children who discovered the secret often felt betrayed, as if adults had tricked them into eating crackers for dessert. Though most admitted the pie tasted delicious regardless of its unconventional filling. The recipe spread through community cookbooks and church newsletters during the 1940s and 1950s, always presented as clever wartime or depression thrift that allowed families to enjoy pie even when fruit remained unaffordable. Ritz cracker pie began disappearing in the 1960s as prosperity made real apples affordable year-round. Frozen apple slices eliminated seasonal limitations, and younger generations rejected the idea of fake pie when authentic versions cost only slightly more. Modern church socials never feature this pie because it seems like unnecessary trickery rather than clever thrift. Contemporary food culture values authenticity and transparency about ingredients, and most people find the concept of cracker pie vaguely disturbing rather than impressively resourceful, like Depression-era cooks intended. Have you ever been completely fooled by a pie that contained no fruit whatsoever? Oatmeal cake brought wholesome breakfast grain to dessert tables, a Depression-era invention that transformed humble oats into surprisingly delicate cake crowned with addictive broiled coconut pecan frosting that made this simple cake irresistible at church socials across America. The recipe began by pouring boiling water over oatmeal and letting it sit until the oats softened and cooled, then mixing this porridge-like base with flour, eggs, sugar, butter, cinnamon, and nutmeg to create batter that baked into unexpectedly tender cake, despite the addition of what seemed like heavy breakfast cereal. Church ladies appreciated that oatmeal cost almost nothing, stretched the batter to feed more people, and added nutritional value that justified eating cake for breakfast at sunrise prayer meetings or weekend church retreats. The distinctive element came from the broiled topping applied after baking, a mixture of butter, brown sugar, coconut, chopped pecans, and cream spread over the warm cake, then placed under the broiler until it bubbled and caramelized into a crunchy, candy-like layer that provided textural contrast to the soft cake beneath. This topping technique required careful watching because the difference between perfectly caramelized and burnt happened in seconds, creating hierarchy among church bakers based on who could achieve flawless golden brown frosting without scorching edges. The entire cake cost well under $1, since oats represented one of the cheapest grains available. Modern church socials rarely feature oatmeal cake because broiled toppings require last-minute preparation that conflicts with make-ahead convenience contemporary cooks demand. The cake's brown color and rough-textured appearance seem plain compared to Instagram-worthy desserts. And most people under 50 have never tasted the remarkable combination of tender oat-studded cake and crunchy caramelized topping that once made this humble dessert a church social legend. Have you ever discovered that breakfast cereal could transform into cake more delicious than desserts made with fancy ingredients? Pistachio cake arrived at church socials wearing its distinctive green color, like a badge of 1970s modernity. A cake that started with boxed mix and instant pudding, yet somehow convinced an entire generation it represented sophisticated European baking, despite containing no actual pistachios. The recipe emerged when food manufacturers promoted pistachio pudding mix as exotic alternative to standard vanilla and chocolate, and creative home bakers discovered that adding the dry pudding mix to white or yellow cake mix, along with eggs, oil, and lemon-lime soda, created a moist cake with unusual flavor and striking pale green color that stood out on crowded dessert tables. Church ladies loved the simplicity. Dump everything in a bowl, mix, bake, and you were done, combined with the impressive appearance that suggested far more effort than the 15 minutes actually required. The frosting typically combined more pistachio pudding mix with Cool Whip and crushed pineapple, creating a fluffy green topping that matched the cake and added tropical sweetness that complemented the pudding's subtle, nutty vanilla flavor. The entire dessert cost well under $1 since cake mix, pudding mix, and soda represented the cheapest possible baking ingredients, and Cool Whip cost less than making real whipped cream, allowing women to contribute beautiful desserts to church events even when budgets were tight. The green color generated strong reactions. Children often loved it for its novelty and association with fun artificial flavors, while older congregation members sometimes rejected it as too modern or suspiciously unnatural looking compared to traditional brown and white cakes they'd grown up eating. The cake worked particularly well for St. Patrick's Day church breakfasts and spring socials, where the green color matched seasonal themes, giving it specific calendar placement in annual church social rotations. Women debated whether to add actual chopped pistachios, despite their expense and the fact that the pistachio pudding flavor. Modern church socials rarely feature pistachio cake because younger generations associate bright green food with artificial ingredients they've been taught to avoid. The cake's retro appearance seems dated rather than nostalgic. Have you ever eaten something green that tasted nothing like the nut it was named after but delicious anyway? 30 forgotten church social desserts once filled basements with sweetness and community, each costing under $1 yet feeding dozens. From Texas sheet cake to oatmeal cake, they represented an era when homemade desserts built fellowship. Today, they've vanished from potluck tables, their recipes disappearing with the grandmothers who perfected them.